The silver moon hung full and bright over the Lazy S Ranch, casting long shadows across the pasture where Rebecca Sterling's prize cattle should have been grazing peacefully through the night. Instead, she stood on her porch with a Winchester rifle cradled in her arms, counting the empty spaces where 20 head of her best breeding stock had vanished sometime between sunset and the rising of the moon that now mocked her with its serene beauty. At 34, Rebecca possessed the kind of strength that frontier life had forged rather than broken, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that revealed the determined set of her jaw and the green eyes that had learned to see threats in every shadow since her husband Samuel had been gunned down by the same rustlers who now seemed determined to strip away everything they had built together. The black dress she wore bore the dust of honest work, rather than the pristine mourning attire of a woman with leisure to grieve properly, and her calloused hands gripped the rifle with the familiarity of someone who had learned that survival depended on being ready to fight for what was hers. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night silence like a knife, and Rebecca raised her rifle with practiced efficiency, knowing that honest folks didn't usually come calling at midnight but that rustlers might return to survey their handiwork or finish what they had started. The rider who emerged from the shadows moved with deliberate slowness, his hands visible on his saddle horn as he approached with the careful respect of a man who understood that armed widows had good reason to be suspicious of strangers. "Ma'am, I heard you've been having trouble with rustlers," came a deep voice from beneath the brim of a well-worn hat, the words carrying a Texas drawl that spoke of long trails and open ranges. "Name's Jack Morrison, and I'm here to see if you might need some help protecting what's yours." Rebecca kept her rifle trained on the stranger even as something in his tone suggested genuine concern rather than threat, her eyes straining to make out his features in the moonlight that silvered everything but revealed little. "Mr. Morrison, if that's really your name, folks who want to help usually come calling during daylight hours when a woman can see their faces and judge their intentions." The man called Jack Morrison chuckled softly, a sound that held no mockery but rather the rueful acknowledgement of someone who recognized the wisdom in her caution. "Yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right about that, but I've been tracking the men who hit your place tonight, and their trail led me here just as they were heading out with your cattle. I figured you'd want to know about it sooner rather than later." Something in his matter-of-fact tone made Rebecca lower her rifle slightly, though she kept it ready as she studied the shadowy figure who claimed to be bringing her information about her stolen livestock. "You say you were tracking them? Are you some kind of lawman, Mr. Morrison?" "Not exactly, ma'am," Jack replied, dismounting slowly and keeping his movements telegraphed and unthreatening. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see those particular rustlers brought to justice, and helping folks like you is part of how I plan to do that." In the moonlight, Rebecca could finally make out more details of her unexpected visitor, a tall man, perhaps 40 years old, with the lean build of someone who lived in the saddle, and something in his posture that suggested both competence and weariness. His clothes were well maintained but worn, the outfit of a working cowboy rather than a drifter or outlaw, and when he removed his hat respectfully, she could see that his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples and his face bore the lines of a man who had seen more than his share of hard times. "What kind of help are you offering, Mr. Morrison?" Rebecca asked, her voice still guarded but no longer openly hostile, as she began to sense that this stranger might indeed be the answer to prayers she had been too proud to voice. "The kind that involves me staying on your property for a while, keeping watch during the nights when rustlers like to work, and making sure they understand that this ranch is protected by someone who knows how to fight back," Jack replied, his blue eyes meeting hers directly despite the shadows that surrounded them. "In exchange for meals and a place to sleep, you'd have someone willing to put his life between your livestock and anyone who thinks a widow makes an easy target." The kitchen where Rebecca served Jack Morrison coffee and day-old biscuits bore the signs of a woman who had learned to manage a ranch operation single-handedly, with ledger books stacked beside sugar bowls and ammunition boxes sharing shelf space with preserving jars. She moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to doing 3 people's work in the time most folks took to accomplish one task. But Jack noted the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, evidence of the strain she had been carrying since her husband's death. "The rustling started about 6 months ago," Rebecca explained as they sat across from each other at the scarred wooden table that had been the heart of her home since she and Samuel had built the ranch 15 years earlier. "At first it was just a few head here and there, easy to write off as strays wandering onto neighboring properties, but it's gotten bolder lately, bigger takes, and always during the new moon when the darkness gives them cover." Jack listened with the attention of a man who understood that the details of criminal patterns could mean the difference between catching thieves and losing everything to them. His weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup as he processed the information she was sharing. How many men would you estimate? Any idea if they're local folks who know the area, or outsiders who've been scouting your operation? I think there are at least 4, maybe 5, Rebecca replied, her voice growing stronger as she focused on facts rather than fears. And they definitely know the land, know where my best grazing areas are and which routes give them the fastest escape toward the hills. Samuel always said that the worst rustlers were the ones who'd been invited to your table, who knew your habits and your weaknesses because you'd trusted them as neighbors. Something in her tone when she mentioned her husband's name made Jack look at her more carefully, noting the way her jaw tightened and her eyes grew distant with memories that were clearly both precious and painful. How long has it been since you lost your husband, Mrs. Sterling, if you don't mind me asking? 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, Rebecca replied without hesitation, the precision of her answer revealing how carefully she had been counting the time since her world had changed forever. He was coming back from town with supplies when they ambushed him on the canyon road. Sheriff said it looked like he tried to fight them off, but there were too many, and they were too well armed. Jack felt his chest tighten with sympathy for the pain in her voice, recognizing the particular quality of grief that came from losing someone to violence rather than accident or illness. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. From what I can see of this place, your husband was a good man who built something worth protecting. The simple acknowledgement of Samuel's worth seemed to crack something inside Rebecca's carefully maintained composure, and tears gathered in her eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain the stoic facade that had gotten her through more than a year of isolation and fear. He was, she said softly. He was the best man I ever knew, and those bastards killed him for a wagon load of supplies that wouldn't have kept them fed for a week. When Jack reached across the table to cover her hand with his own, the gesture was so gentle and respectful that Rebecca didn't pull away, finding unexpected comfort in the simple human contact that reminded her she didn't have to face everything alone. Mrs. Sterling, I give you my word that I'll do everything in my power to make sure those men don't take anything else from you. Not your cattle, not your peace of mind, and certainly not your life. The intensity in his voice made Rebecca look at him more carefully, seeing past the weathered exterior to recognize something that looked like personal mission in his eyes. You said you had your own reasons for wanting to catch these rustlers. What kind of reasons, Mr. Morrison? Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on their joined hands as he seemed to debate how much of his own story he was willing to share with a woman he had just met. Let's just say that the men who've been stealing your cattle have taken things from me too, things that can never be replaced, and I figure that helping you stop them might be the first step toward getting the justice that's been a long time coming. The first night of Jack's protection duty passed quietly, with Rebecca lying awake in her bedroom listening to the soft sounds of him moving around the ranch buildings, checking locks, and positioning himself where he could observe the most likely approaches for rustlers seeking to strike again. The knowledge that someone else was sharing the burden of vigilance allowed her to relax in ways she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death, though she found herself wondering about the stranger who had appeared so opportunely when she needed help most desperately. Dawn brought the opportunity for a more thorough discussion of their arrangement. As Rebecca prepared breakfast for two for the first time in over a year, while Jack tended to his horse and examined the ranch's defenses with the eye of someone who understood both livestock management and military tactics, she watched him from her kitchen window as he walked the fence lines and studied sight lines, noting the professional competence with which he assessed potential vulnerabilities. Find anything that concerns you? Rebecca asked when Jack entered the kitchen for the meal she had prepared, his hair damp from washing at the pump and his expression thoughtful in the morning light that revealed details obscured by darkness. Your husband chose his location well, Jack replied, accepting the plate of eggs and bacon with gratitude that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. Good natural barriers on 3 sides, clear sight lines across the approaches, and defensible positions if it comes to that. The problem is that you can't be everywhere at once, and experienced rustlers know how to wait for the moments when you're necessarily distracted by other work. Rebecca poured coffee and settled across from him, surprised to find that sharing breakfast felt natural rather than awkward, despite the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance. So, what do you recommend? I can't afford to hire additional hands, and most of the neighboring ranchers have their own problems with theft. What I recommend is that we work together to set a trap, Jack said, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. These men have gotten comfortable thinking of your ranch as easy pickings, which means they've gotten careless. Careless men make mistakes, and mistakes can be turned into opportunities for folks who are patient and smart about how they respond. The plan Jack outlined was both simple and dangerous, involving the deliberate exposure of her best cattle in a pasture that could be observed from concealed positions, with Rebecca maintaining her normal routines while Jack remained hidden and ready to intercept any rustlers who took the bait. The risk was considerable, but so was the potential reward of finally catching the men who had been systematically destroying her livelihood. "It means you'll be out there alone for most of the night," Rebecca said, her voice carrying concern that surprised her with its depth. "What if there are more of them than we expect? What if they're better armed than you anticipated?" Jack's smile was grim but confident as he met her worried gaze. "Mrs. Sterling, I've been in worse situations with worse odds, and I'm still here to tell about it. Besides, the alternative is letting them continue to bleed you dry until there's nothing left to protect." That evening, as they made final preparations for their trap, Rebecca found herself studying Jack's profile in the lamplight and wondering about the experiences that had given him such confidence in dangerous situations. There was something about his calm competence that suggested military training, but also a hardness around his eyes that spoke of personal losses that had marked him in ways that went deeper than professional experience. "Jack," she said as he checked his weapons with the methodical attention of someone whose life depended on their proper function, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for your help, but I also want you to promise me something." "What's that, ma'am?" "Promise me you won't take unnecessary risks on my account," Rebecca said, her voice soft but urgent. "I've already lost one good man to these bastards, and I don't think I could bear the guilt of losing another because I asked for help I had no right to expect." The trap they set played out exactly as Jack had predicted, with the rustlers arriving just after midnight when the moon was obscured by clouds and approaching the exposed cattle with the overconfident movements of men who believed they were stealing from a helpless widow. With no means of resistance, Rebecca watched from her darkened bedroom window as shadowy figures moved among her livestock, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and anticipation as she waited for Jack's signal to begin their coordinated response. When Jack's rifle shot shattered the night silence, it was followed immediately by shouts of surprise and anger from the rustlers who suddenly found themselves caught in the open with nowhere to run. Rebecca emerged from the house with her own weapon ready, adding her firepower to Jack's as they systematically disabled the thieves' horses and drove the men toward the natural trap formed by the ranch's canyon walls. "That's far enough." Jack's voice carried across the moonlit pasture with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his rifle trained on the leader of the rustling gang with steady precision. "Drop your weapons and put your hands where I can see them, or I'll be happy to end this conversation permanently." The capture of 4 rustlers red-handed with Rebecca's cattle provided the evidence needed to ensure their conviction and transportation to the territorial prison. But more importantly for Rebecca, it eliminated the immediate threat that had been hanging over her ranch for months. As she and Jack worked together to secure the prisoners and recover her stolen livestock, she found herself marveling at the efficiency of their partnership and the sense of security that came from having someone to share both the dangers and the victories. "We make a good team," Jack observed as they watched the sheriff's deputy lead the captured rustlers away in chains, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that went beyond the successful completion of their mission. "We do," Rebecca agreed, surprised by how reluctant she was to see their partnership end now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. "But I suppose you'll be moving on now that the job is finished?" Jack turned to look at her in the pre-dawn light that was beginning to paint the eastern horizon with fingers of gold and pink, his expression serious as he seemed to weigh his words carefully. "That depends, Mrs. Sterling. The rustlers we caught tonight were working for someone else, someone who's been organizing cattle theft throughout this part of the territory. My job isn't finished until I find the man giving the orders." The revelation that their victory was only the beginning of a larger campaign both thrilled and terrified Rebecca, offering the prospect of Jack's continued presence, while also suggesting that greater dangers might lie ahead. "How long do you think it will take to track down their leader?" "Hard to say," Jack replied, his gaze growing distant as he considered the challenges ahead. "Could be weeks, could be months. The question is whether you'd be willing to let me continue using your ranch as a base of operations while I pursue the investigation." Rebecca felt her heart leap with an emotion that had nothing to do with the practical benefits of his protection and everything to do with the growing attachment she was developing to the man who had appeared when she needed him most. "Of course you can stay," she said, then felt her cheeks warm as she realized how eager she sounded. I mean, it would be foolish to refuse help when there might be more trouble coming. Just help? Jack asked softly, his blue eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch as she realized they were standing close enough to touch, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair and the small scar that marked his left cheek. I don't know, Rebecca whispered honestly, her heart racing as she acknowledged feelings that had been growing stronger with each hour they spent working together. I don't know what this is or what it might become, but I know I'm not ready for it to end. The weeks that followed their successful trap settled into a rhythm that transformed Rebecca's isolated ranch into something that felt like a shared enterprise, with Jack's presence changing not just her security situation, but the entire atmosphere of the property. They worked together with increasing ease, Jack proving surprisingly skilled at ranch maintenance tasks, while Rebecca found herself consulting him on decisions that she had been making alone since Samuel's death. The evenings were the most dangerous time, not because of external threats but because of the growing intimacy that developed as they shared meals and conversation in the kitchen that had once echoed with loneliness. Jack proved to be an engaging storyteller with a dry sense of humor that could coax laughter from Rebecca even on days when grief still ambushed her unexpectedly, and she found herself looking forward to these quiet hours together with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. You mentioned that you had military experience, Rebecca said one evening as they lingered over coffee and the apple pie she had baked that afternoon, noting the way Jack's posture straightened slightly at the reference to his past. Were you in the war? Jack was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he seemed to debate how much of his history he was willing to share. I was, he said finally. Served with the Texas Rangers afterward, too, until I decided that wearing a badge wasn't the best way to get the kind of justice I was looking for. The careful way he spoke about his law enforcement career made Rebecca suspect there was more to the story than he was telling, but she had learned to recognize the signs of a man who carried wounds that weren't entirely healed. Is that why you're tracking the rustling operation on your own instead of working with the sheriff's department? Partly, Jack replied, his blue eyes meeting hers with an honesty that made her chest tighten with sympathy. The leader of this rustling ring is a man named Colt Davidson, and he's got connections that run pretty deep in local law enforcement. Fighting him through official channels means fighting a system that's already corrupted by his money and influence. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition at the name Jack had mentioned, memories flooding back of conversations with Samuel about a businessman who had tried repeatedly to buy their ranch for far less than it's worth. I know that name, she said slowly. Davidson made offers to buy our place several times, always low offers that Samuel said were more like threats than honest negotiations. Something shifted in Jack's expression at her words, a hardening that transformed his features from merely weathered to genuinely dangerous. Rebecca, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Davidson's approaches to your husband. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. The urgency in his voice made Rebecca's pulse quicken as she began to understand that her ranch's troubles might be part of a larger pattern of intimidation and theft designed to force small ranchers off their land. As she recounted Samuel's descriptions of Davidson's visits and veiled threats, she could see Jack building a mental picture of a criminal enterprise, far more sophisticated than simple cattle rustling. He wanted this land specifically, Rebecca concluded, her voice growing stronger as anger began to override her fear. Samuel always said Davidson wasn't just making offers, he was making promises about what would happen if we didn't sell voluntarily. And when you refused to sell, the rustling started, Jack said grimly, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. Rebecca, I think your husband was killed because he stood between Davidson and something he wanted badly enough to commit murder for. The possibility that Samuel's death had been not just robbery but assassination sent waves of rage and grief through Rebecca's system, but also a fierce determination to see justice done for the man who had died protecting the life they had built together. What do we do about it? She asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. We gather evidence, Jack replied, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles in a touch that sent unexpected warmth through her, despite the grimness of their conversation. And we make sure Davidson understands that this ranch is no longer an easy target for his intimidation tactics. The investigation into Davidson's criminal network required Jack to be away from the ranch for days at a time, gathering intelligence and building connections with other ranchers who had suffered similar losses, leaving Rebecca to manage the property alone. while worrying about his safety in ways that revealed how deeply her feelings for him had developed. When he returned from these expeditions, dust-covered and exhausted, she found herself greeting him with relief that went far beyond concern for her protector. "Any luck?" Rebecca asked as Jack unsaddled his horse after a 3-day absence that had felt like a month, noting the grim satisfaction in his expression that suggested important progress in their investigation. "Better than luck," Jack replied, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him with gratitude that made her heart flutter despite the serious nature of their conversation. "I found 2 other widows whose husbands died under suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell their ranches to Davidson. I also found a former deputy who's willing to testify about being pressured to falsify reports that covered up evidence of Davidson's involvement in cattle theft." The prospect of finally having enough evidence to bring Davidson to justice filled Rebecca with fierce satisfaction, but also with awareness that their partnership was approaching a conclusion that would force them to confront feelings they had been carefully avoiding discussing directly. "How soon do you think you'll have enough to approach the territorial authorities?" Jack studied her face in the lamplight that flickered between them, his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch as she recognized desire warring with duty in his expression. "Soon," he said quietly. "Maybe too soon." The admission hung between them like a bridge across all the careful distances they had maintained, giving Rebecca permission to acknowledge what had been growing in her heart despite her attempts to focus solely on practical matters of ranch management and criminal investigation. "Jack, what happens when this is all over? When Davidson is in prison and you've gotten the justice you came here seeking?" "I don't know," he replied honestly, setting down his coffee cup and reaching for her hand with fingers that trembled slightly despite his outward composure. "I've been asking myself the same question every day for weeks now, and the only answer I keep coming up with scares me more than facing down armed rustlers." "What answer is that?" "That maybe I've found something here worth staying for," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper as he voiced the hope that had been growing stronger with each passing day. "Maybe I've found someone who makes the idea of hanging up my guns and learning to be a rancher sound like the best future I could imagine." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes as she heard him voice the possibility that had been taking shape in her own heart. The dream of building something permanent with this man who had appeared when she needed him most, and stayed to become so much more than just her protector. "Are you asking me if I think there might be a place for you here permanently?" "I'm asking if you think there might be a place for me in your life permanently," Jack corrected gently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that sent shivers of awareness through her entire body. "I'm asking if you think it's possible for a woman to love again after losing someone she thought was irreplaceable." The question forced Rebecca to confront the guilt she had been carrying about her growing feelings for Jack, the sense that caring for someone new somehow diminished what she had shared with Samuel. But looking into Jack's eyes, she realized that love wasn't a finite resource that required rationing, but rather something that could expand to encompass new possibilities without negating precious memories. "I think," she said carefully, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to voice her heart's truth, "that Samuel would want me to be happy. And I think you make me happier than I ever thought I could be again." When Jack leaned across the table to kiss her, it was with a tenderness that acknowledged both the preciousness of what they were discovering together and the courage it had taken for both of them to risk their hearts again after experiencing profound loss. The confrontation with Colt Davidson came sooner than either of them expected, arriving in the form of 6 armed men who rode onto Rebecca's property just before dawn with the arrogant confidence of people who believed they were above any law that might protect honest ranchers from intimidation and theft. Rebecca and Jack had been prepared for such a visit ever since word had spread that they were gathering evidence against Davidson's organization, but the reality of facing down overwhelming odds tested every aspect of their partnership. Mrs. Sterling, called the leader of the group, a well-dressed man whose expensive clothes couldn't disguise the cold calculation in his eyes. "I believe you know who I am. I'm here to make you one final offer for your property, and I'd strongly advise you to consider it carefully." Rebecca emerged from her house with her rifle ready and Jack's reassuring presence beside her, drawing strength from the solid warmth of the man who had taught her that she didn't have to face everything alone. "Mr. Davidson, the only thing I'm considering is how quickly I can get you off my land before I lose my patience and start shooting trespassers." Davidson's smile was cold and predatory as he gestured toward his armed companions, his confidence in his superior firepower evident in every line of his posture. "Mrs. Sterling, I think you're forgetting that you're outnumbered and outgunned. It would be much simpler for everyone involved if you just signed the papers and took the money we're offering. The lady isn't interested in your money," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that made smart men reconsider their courses of action. And neither am I. What we're interested in is seeing you pay for the murder of Samuel Sterling and the theft of livestock from half a dozen ranches in this territory. Something shifted in Davidson's expression at Jack's words, recognition replacing arrogance as he realized that his opponents were better informed and more dangerous than he had anticipated. Well, Jack Morrison, the famous ex-ranger who's been causing me so much trouble lately. I wondered when you'd show yourself openly instead of skulking around gathering gossip from disgruntled ranchers. The history between the two men was evident in the tension that crackled between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. Years of cat-and-mouse investigation, culminating in this moment of direct confrontation that would determine the future of everyone present. "Hello, Colt," Jack replied, his hand resting casually on his gun butt in a gesture that was both relaxed and threatening. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Have you now?" Davidson's laugh was ugly as he signaled his men to spread out in a formation that would give them clear fields of fire while minimizing their exposure to return shots. "And what exactly did you hope to accomplish by coming here to die with this stubborn woman?" "I hope to give you one chance to surrender before I killed you," Jack said simply, his words carrying such matter-of-fact certainty that even Davidson's hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles. The gunfight that followed was brief and decisive, with Jack's superior skill and Rebecca's knowledge of her own property combining to overcome the numerical advantage of Davidson's forces. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Davidson's men lay dead and the rest, including Davidson himself, were wounded and disarmed, finally vulnerable to the justice they had avoided for so long through corruption and intimidation. "It's over," Jack said softly as they stood together surveying the aftermath of the battle that had settled both his personal quest for justice and Rebecca's fight to protect her ranch. "Davidson will go to prison for Samuel's murder, and his organization won't be stealing any more cattle or threatening any more widows." Rebecca looked at the man who had risked everything to help her fight for what was hers, understanding that their partnership had been tested in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. "What happens now?" she asked, though she thought she could see the answer in his eyes. The trial of Colt Davidson and his surviving associates became the largest criminal proceeding in the territory's recent history, with testimony from dozens of victims whose stories painted a clear picture of a criminal organization that had terrorized honest ranchers for years, through theft, intimidation, and murder. Rebecca and Jack testified together about the evidence they had gathered and the battle that had finally brought Davidson's reign of terror to an end, their partnership in the courtroom as effective as it had been on the ranch. "The defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit theft, and numerous other charges that will ensure he spends the rest of his natural life in territorial prison," the judge pronounced with satisfaction that reflected the community's relief at finally seeing justice done. "This court thanks Mrs. Sterling and Mr. Morrison for their courage in bringing these criminals to justice despite considerable personal risk." The weeks following the trial allowed Rebecca and Jack to begin planning a future that no longer revolved around survival and justice, but rather around the quieter challenges of building a life together on the ranch that had brought them together. They worked side by side, repairing damage from the final confrontation and improving the property in ways that reflected their shared vision of what their home could become. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd," Rebecca said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, her head resting against Jack's shoulder in a gesture that had become natural and precious to both of them. "Maybe branching out into horses as well as cattle. If we can manage the additional workload, we can manage anything as long as we're working together," Jack replied, his arm tightening around her as he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I should probably mention that I've been thinking about something else that might require some expansion around here." Something in his tone made Rebecca look up at him with curiosity, noting the mixture of nervousness and anticipation in his expression that suggested he was building up to something important. "What kind of expansion are you talking about?" Jack shifted slightly so he could look at her directly, his blue eyes holding the same intensity that had marked all their most significant conversations. "The kind that involves adding a few more bedrooms to the house, maybe building a bigger dining table, creating space for the children we might be blessed with if we decide to make our partnership official." The mention of children and official partnerships made Rebecca's heart race with possibilities she had thought lost forever when Samuel died, dreams of family and permanence that Jack was offering to help her rebuild in ways that honored her past while embracing their future together. Jack Morrison, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is temporary, Jack said with a smile that transformed his weathered features with joy and hope. I'm proposing that we acknowledge what we both know to be true, that we're better together than either of us could ever be apart, and that we've found something worth building a lifetime around. When Rebecca kissed him in response, it was with all the passion and gratitude of a woman who had learned that love could indeed bloom twice in one lifetime, that hearts could heal and expand to encompass new possibilities without betraying cherished memories. Yes, she whispered against his lips, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally found her way home. The wedding took place on a golden September morning in the meadow, where Rebecca's cattle grazed peacefully under the protection of the man who had fought to save them. With half the territory's population in attendance to celebrate the union of two people whose love story had become legend throughout the region, Rebecca wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her figure, while Jack stood beside her in a new suit that couldn't quite conceal the gun belt he still wore out of habit and caution. Do you, Rebecca, take Jack to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? The circuit preacher's words carried across the assembled crowd, with the authority of someone who understood the significance of promises made in frontier country, where survival often depended on the strength of partnerships. I do, Rebecca said firmly, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow, as she looked into the eyes of the man who had taught her that courage and love were not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary forces that could overcome any obstacle when combined with determination and trust. Jack's vows were spoken with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything important in his life, his promises carrying the weight of a man who understood that marriage was not just a legal arrangement, but a sacred partnership that would define the rest of their lives together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a crowd that understood they were celebrating not just a wedding, but the triumph of love over loss, hope over despair, and justice over corruption. The reception that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing that transformed Rebecca's ranch into a place of celebration rather than the battlefield it had so recently been. As she and Jack moved together in the wedding waltz, she marveled at how completely her life had changed from the terrified widow who had stood alone with a rifle just a few months earlier. Any regrets, Mrs. Morrison? Jack asked softly as they swayed together under the stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations and their growing love. Only that it took so long for you to find me, Rebecca replied, her hand resting over his heart as she felt the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Though I suppose we both needed time to become the people who could recognize what we'd found when we finally found it. As the celebration continued around them, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate nights when rustlers had threatened everything she held dear to the quiet mornings, when she now woke in Jack's arms feeling safer and more loved than she had ever thought possible. The ranch that had once been a burden she carried alone had become a symbol of what two people could accomplish when they combined their strengths and faced their challenges together. I love you, Jack Morrison, she whispered as they danced under the moonlight that had once seemed to mock her loneliness but now blessed their union with silver radiance. And I love you, Rebecca Morrison, he replied, his voice carrying the wonder of a man who had found everything he had been searching for in the arms of a woman brave enough to trust her heart to a stranger who had proven himself worthy of that trust. 5 years later, Rebecca stood in the kitchen of the expanded ranch house, preparing breakfast for a family that now included not just herself and Jack but also 3-year-old Samuel and baby Sarah, children whose laughter had filled the spaces that grief had once occupied, and whose futures stretched bright and hopeful across the same landscape that had once seemed so threatening and uncertain. The ranch itself had prospered beyond their most optimistic dreams, growing from Rebecca's modest cattle operation into one of the territory's most successful horse and cattle breeding enterprises, with Jack's reputation for integrity and skill, bringing customers from hundreds of miles away to purchase livestock that bore the sterling Morrison brand. But more than financial success, they had built something that felt permanent and precious, a legacy that honored Samuel's memory while celebrating the love that had grown from the ashes of loss. Mama, Papa's coming, a young Samuel announced from his perch at the kitchen window, his excited voice carrying the same joy that filled Rebecca's heart every time she saw Jack returning from his work around the ranch. The little boy had been named for the husband she had lost but bore the features and temperament of the man who had raised him as his own son from birth. creating a beautiful bridge between Rebecca's past and present. "Is he bringing Uncle Tom with him?" Rebecca asked, referring to the retired sheriff's deputy who had become Jack's partner in their expanded security consultation business, helping other ranchers protect their property from the criminal organizations that still occasionally tested the territory's law enforcement capabilities. "Yes, and they have papers," Samuel reported with the enthusiasm of a child who found all adult business fascinating, though he couldn't yet understand the significance of the legal documents that Jack and Tom carried as they approached the house. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch to greet her husband, noting the satisfaction in his expression that suggested good news about their latest case. Over the years, Jack had built a reputation as the man to call when rustlers or land grabbers threatened honest ranchers, his success rate and methods making him legendary throughout the territory, while allowing him to protect their own growing family and prosperous ranch. "How did it go in town?" Rebecca asked as Jack dismounted and gathered her into the embrace that still made her pulse quicken after 5 years of marriage, and their physical connection as strong as ever, despite the comfortable familiarity that had grown between them. "Better than we hoped," Jack replied, his blue eyes bright with triumph as he gestured toward the papers Tom carried. "Davidson's appeals have all been exhausted, and the territorial governor has officially commended our work in breaking up the cattle theft rings. More importantly, we've been offered a contract to help establish security protocols for the entire Northern Territory." The success of Jack's consulting business filled Rebecca with pride, but also with the knowledge that their partnership had created something larger than either of them could have achieved alone. Together, they had built not just a prosperous ranch and a loving family, but also a legacy of justice that was making life safer for honest folks throughout the region. "And the best part," Tom added with a grin that made him look 20 years younger, "is that this new contract is based right here, which means Jack won't have to travel as much and can spend more time with his beautiful family." As they gathered around the breakfast table that had once seated only Rebecca in lonely isolation, she marveled at how completely her life had been transformed by the man who had appeared one moonlit night, offering protection and stayed to become her partner in every aspect of life. Baby Sarah gurgled contentedly in her high chair while young Samuel chattered about his plans for the day, creating the kind of domestic symphony that Rebecca had once thought lost forever. "Do you ever miss the excitement of those early days?" she asked Jack quietly as they watched their children play together in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. "The adventure and danger of tracking down criminals and fighting for justice?" Jack's smile was warm and certain as he reached for her hand across the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their private signal of love and unity. "Rebecca, every day with you and our children is more adventure than I ever dreamed of having. The excitement of watching Samuel learn to ride, of seeing Sarah take her first steps, of working alongside the woman I love to build something that will last for generations, that's worth more than all the gunfights and manhunts in the world." As the morning sun climbed higher over their prosperous ranch, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them from those first tentative conversations in her kitchen to this moment of perfect contentment, surrounded by the family they had created together. The moonlit nights that had once been filled with fear and vigilance now brought peaceful rest in the arms of a man who had proved that love could indeed bloom from the seeds of crisis, that trust could grow even in hearts that had been broken by loss. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures protected by fences that Jack had built and boundaries that his reputation defended, while horses bearing their brand grazed in fields that stretched toward horizons bright with promise rather than threat. In the distance, she could see the small cemetery where Samuel rested beneath a headstone that bore not just his name and dates but also the inscription Jack had suggested: "Beloved husband whose dreams live on in the family he protected and the land he loved. Thank you," Rebecca whispered to Jack as they stood together on the porch watching their children play in the yard, where she had once stood alone with a rifle, surrounded now by the peace and security that love had built from the foundations of courage and determination. "Thank you for what?" Jack asked, though his smile suggested he understood the depth of gratitude that simple phrase could barely contain. "For appearing when I needed you most," she replied, her voice rich with emotion as she remembered that first night when a stranger's offer of help had begun the greatest adventure of her life. "For staying when you could have moved on, for fighting when others would have run, and for loving me enough to help me build something beautiful from the ashes of everything I thought I'd lost." When Jack kissed her in response, it was with all the passion and tenderness of their wedding day, but also with the deeper appreciation that came from years of shared challenges overcome and dreams achieved together. Around them, Their ranch hummed with the quiet prosperity that honest work and mutual love could create, while their children's laughter carried on the wind like a promise that the future they had built together would continue to flourish long after the moonlit nights of danger had faded into cherished memory. The heart that had learned to trust again beat strong and sure in Rebecca's chest as she looked out over the land that Jack had helped her defend and the family they had created together, knowing that sometimes the greatest love stories began not with courtship and romance, but with the simple offer of help from a stranger who proved worthy of a lifetime's trust. Under the same moon that had once witnessed their first tentative partnership, they had built a love as enduring as the prairie itself, as vast as the sky that stretched endlessly above their home, and as precious as the peace they had fought so hard to achieve.